the focus of these forums is to think about the person who's the interlocutor's relationship to the material and what brought them to the material. And there's a lot to talk about with James Baldwin, more than I can fill with, more than multiple half-hour conversations. So I wanted to focus on why James Baldwin for me, because to look at me, there's not much James Baldwin and I would have a connection. But the simple title of this is James Baldwin Witness. And I wanted to focus on his idea of witness and what witness meant and what witness means to me as an academic, a writer, a person of faith who struggles with faith, which is very much important to James Baldwin. And that struggle relates to his idea of witness. And so you might know, there was sort of, in the common knowledge, there's a lot to know about James Baldwin. He, of course, was a writer, famous for his essays, most famous for The Fire Next Time, and as brilliant as a writer he was, and he was a brilliant writer. His novels, less known as George mentioned, the plays, is also a great speaker. If you have a chance to go, I think the Cambridge debate with William F. Buckley is on YouTube. Go look at that. He did an interview for the television program Soul with Nikki Giovanni, the poet. If you have Amazon Prime, it is on Amazon Prime, and I recommend that you do that. Why was he such a great speaker? And his writing comes out of his oratory and back and forth, is he started as a youth minister. The man he understood to be his father, who was his stepfather, was a deacon in a Pentecostal church up in Harlem. And James Baldwin became a youth, actually sort of eclipsed his stepfather in fame in order, as a youth minister for a few years before he abandoned that. And so I want to talk a little bit about, forgive me, I have notes because I want to be accurate. So witness, what is witness? And I draw our attention to Acts 22, verse 15. For thou shalt be his witness unto all men of what thou hast seen and heard. Of course, this is Paul reflecting on his revelation on the road to Damascus. And for Baldwin, witness was his mission statement, if you will, to be his witness of everything that has seen and heard. We think of him in terms of the civil rights movement, and he was of the civil rights movement, but he was not in the civil rights movement. He was friends with Medgar Evers, but he was not in the NAACP. He was friends with Martin Luther King Jr., but he was not in the SCLC. He was friends with Malcolm X, but he was not a black Muslim. He knew John Lewis, but he was not in SNCC, so on and so forth. He was of these movements, but he was not in them. His job was to go and to see and to, in a way, partly what a reporter does, but also witness, to go and see survey the land, come back and to report and to share what he has seen. And there's a particularly very sort of Paulian vision in that, but which also has some secular components. I mentioned Eddie Glaude Jr. before his Begin Again, and this was the last time I spoke about Baldwin, was because of Eddie's book. And Eddie says in this, I thought of Baldwin's witness in his later years as an answer to my questions and part of the reason why I needed to write this book. He grappled with profound disillusionment after the murder of Dr. King, and yet held on to his faith and the possibility of a moment when we could all be fully ourselves, what he referenced to as a new Jerusalem. I understand how he did that and what resources, as he confronted his dark America, he might offer me as I confront the darkness of my own. Baldwin writes in The Fire Next Time, it is not too much to say that whoever wishes to become a truly moral human being, and let us not ask whether or not this is possible, I think we must believe it is possible, must first divorce himself from all the prohibitions, crimes, and hypocrisies of the Christian church. And these are hard words to hear. He continues, if the concept of God has any validity or any use, it can only be to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God could not do this, then it is time we got rid of him. Again, hard words. Baldwin had great struggles with the Christian church, both what was understood to be the black church and the white church of his time. His play, Blues for Mr. Charlie, very much is about his troubles. But Baldwin was not an atheist. I would say he was an institutionalist. But he was a person of great spirituality, great faith, and that he believed in the ineffable nature of the human soul. And that ineffable nature of the human soul existed in us. And if we could get rid of all of these things that divide us, race, class, all the things that all the tribalisms that build walls between us, and get to that part, what does he say? I think this resonates for us as Episcopalians. To make us larger, freer, and more loving. And that ultimately is the purpose of his witness. He's reporting on he's reporting on the horrors of Jim Crow, the horrors of lynching, the horrors. His friend, Medgar Evers, is murdered in his own driveway while his family is in the house getting ready for dinner. And his job is to tell that story. But the goal of telling that story is to sort of get us all past that to a larger vision of us that's not based on whiteness or blackness or this or that, but on our essential humanity. Right? In his first collection of essays he wrote in the 1950s, he said he just wants to be known as James Baldwin writer. Not as a James Baldwin writer, not as a black writer or a gay writer, but just James Baldwin writer. I draw from Ernest L. Gibson's Sapphic Manhood, James Baldwin's novelization of male intimacy. I brought this because it's quite extensive, what I want to read, so forgive me. But I think this is important for us, and it's important for me. There is now a classic photo of a 1963 James Baldwin standing in a church pulpit at a podium draped with the phrase, "God is love." The idea captured by this photo mirrors Baldwin's radical philosophy of love, a philosophy born out of the black church and a Christian ethos. The statement is both an identification of God's warmth and gentle embrace of humankind, of the principles by which we are to live, as well as an ontological claim that speaks to the heart or essence of a Western conception of God. When I first saw the photo, I thought of my grandmother. This is the author of this speaking, of those earliest teachings of God, of Baldwin's earliest teachings. If God is love, And God is also salvation. What does that say about the relationship between the power to love and to the power to save? Does it not beg up for us to consider how love functions or operates in the inevitable calling for us to be saved? Does it not encourage us to rethink or reconsider the ontology of religion? Baldwin's God is Love photo, in the context of his writings, invites us to refigure and expand on how we have come to know God and exactly what we mean by religion. I am interested in the ways in which journeying into the worlds of novelistic Baldwin encourages a reconfiguration of religion or its sovereignty over the conception of God as love and salvation. That is, what happens when we reimagine the objects of religion as shareable. We met how that they can be located within different institutions with the same potency. Baldwin's witness is devoted not to thinking about how to get into heaven, but how that we can let the spirit of God is love enter us, and for that to animate us, and how to live on this earth, and to live with our neighbors, and to live with those who are different than us. That doesn't mean there are times when he's not angry. He's often angry. That doesn't mean times he's not frustrated. He is often frustrated. But he also recognizes that he said he never believed that all white people were devils. Some were devils. He writes about a few. There's one particular, if you've ever read Going to Meet the Man, a short story. There's a deputy sheriff in there, very much a devil, but not all. Not all. He writes in the foreword to Blues for Mr. Charlie. Now, this is one of his plays. And, as I'm writing my book, I've just finished writing the section on this play, which has a really complicated story how to get there, and I'll share it with you at another time. But he writes in the foreword, when Medgar Evers died, something entered into me which I cannot describe. But it was then that I resolved that nothing under heaven would prevent me from getting this play done. We are walking in a terrible darkness here, and this one man's attempt to bear witness to the reality and power of the light. For him, the process of how, we talked about why witness was important to him. How does he share his witness? Through the gift that he valued the most. Right? He said, James Baldwin, writer. To write is to witness. And again, we know him for his essays. We know him for his novels. We don't know him much about for his plays. And there's a lot of reasons, very hard for an African-American writer at the time to get work done on Broadway or in Hollywood. But for him, theater was the space, the best space to articulate witness. And why is that? Theater itself has its origins not in a secular tradition. It wasn't existed, to have, didn't exist to, have fun shows on Broadway. That's not what the origins. Its origins were religious. Going back to the ancient Greeks. Those plays were the plays that we know, the Oedipus plays, Medea, Bacchae, so on and so forth, were part of a religious festival done in spring at the time of renewal. And they were done, there was a whole, the theatrical space was sanctified through animal sacrifice. And at these plays, the person the chief priest of the god, Dionysus, sat where my mother is sitting right now, center. So the god, the representation of the god was there to witness the witnessing of that. In the play Blues for Mr. Charlie, it has one set that serves two locations, a church and a courtroom, which both are spaces of witnessing and both have similar configurations. So if you're now sitting in a church, but if you can imagine a courtroom, you would be sitting in a very similar position. And it is within this space of witnessing. And Baldwin's conception too, he didn't just write plays. He was trying to change. Blues for Mr. Charlie premiered at Broadway in 1964. He was trying to change, not only write a play for Broadway, but he was trying to change the Broadway audience. Again, I'm not going to go into details, but he was trying to, Broadway's audience at the time was pretty exclusively white in 1964. He was trying to integrate the Broadway audience, which honestly hasn't happened until the past 20 years. But he was there and he was determined to change that audience, to make not only the play an act of witnessing, but the act of seeing the play, who you're sharing the space with, an act of witnessing. And it's about the play is built upon, it's inspired by both the murders of Emmett Till and Medgar Evers. For Black and white audiences to share that experience together, to have that common humanity together. That's important. That sense of this communal sharing of not, for Baldwin, he lived primarily, his heritage was the South, but he lived in the North. And what he saw was in the North, a lot of white people hiding behind their innocence. Oh, I didn't know. It's like, you can't hide behind your innocence. You have to know. Part of my witnessing is to tell you so you know. And you get beyond that and you understand the horrors that are happening. All right. In The Devil Finds Work, his essay on theater and film, Baldwin writes, the tension of the theater is very different and a very particular tension. This tension between the real and the imagined is the theater. This is why the theater will always remain a necessity. One is not in the presence of shadows, but responding to one's flesh and blood. In the theater, we are recreating each other, right? With a novel, one is sitting alone in one's room, and you're just one-on-one engagement with the author. In the theater, again, it's that community experience, that communal experience where we are recreating each other. And again, it's, as I mentioned before, Baldwin is very much about how do we live here on earth? How do we engage, negotiate, live with our common? How do we get past these barriers? And part of that too is love in all of its aspects. Both in terms of a spiritual love, but also a sensual love, a physical love too. All of this together. That, part of our existence is our bodies. Part of what Jim Crow and slavery are is an enslavement of bodies. And being free is to be truly free in our bodies as well as our souls. And so in his novel From Another Country, it's the first 20% of it is about Rufus, who's a struggling jazz musician. I guess I don't need word struggling is redundant. Struggling jazz musician who walks. It's an interior monologue. If he walks from Times Square to George Washington Bridge, where he jumps off the bridge, and it details all the struggling. The rest of the novel is about all the people in Rufus's lives trying to kind of pick up the pieces of this loss. But there's this moment, so right after his suicide, we go to his funeral. And there the character of Reverend Foster is speaking. And I think this gets to the heart of, again, Baldwin's theology of witness. You know, a lot of people say that a man who takes his own life oughtn't to be buried in holy ground. I don't know nothing about that. All I know, God made every bit of ground I ever walked on, and everything God made is holy. I'm going to read that again. All I know, God made every bit of ground I ever walked on, and everything God made is holy. And don't none of us know what goes on in the heart of someone. Don't any of us know what's going on in our own hearts, for that matter, of that. And so can't none of us say why he did what he did. Ain't none of us been there, and so don't none of us know. We got to pray that the Lord will receive him like we pray that the Lord's going to receive us. That's all. That's all. Everything God made is holy. And part of Baldwin's writing is in service of that idea, right? So when he writes, if you've seen movies from the late 1950s and the 1960s with African-American characters, usually played by Sidney Poitier, right? These very stoic figures of absolute moral rectitude, right? Who like take the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune and just, he said, that's not real. We get angry, we get disappointment, we love, we fear, we break. And so one of the achievements of Baldwin was not the first African-American writer, but he was the first African-American writer to show the African-American community, right? And how they live. And some of them are not good to their spouses. Some of them have hard days at the job. Some of them are not loving as they should. Something like they struggle, as we all do, trying to go, but that's the human truth of it, warts and all. And all of those struggles, all the ups and downs and flaws, and they stand by their strengths and fall by their weaknesses, all of that is holy. Right? All of that. And get past these notions of who we are, or obviously Paul was living in a very politically charged era and time. But get past the politics to the human truth. He writes in If Beale Street Could Talk, "This is the sacrament," she said. "And no, I ain't gone crazy. We're drinking to new life. Tish is going to have Fottie's baby." She touched Joseph. "Drink," she said. This baby, that's the mother's family, the father's family, they can't stand each other, right? We all know this. Fottie's in trouble with the police. He shouldn't be, but it's early 1970s. They're striving, they're struggling, And this one family, the not the father himself, but his family wants an abortion, even though they're very, very sanctimonious and all other things. She's like, no, this is a sacrament, right? This is a healing, and there's a lot of very specific allusions to the nativity that are sort of peppered throughout this particular novel. And that's what ultimately brings me to Baldwin, I think, to bring it back to myself. Right? As a writer, as someone who writes creatively, but also academically, why do what I do? What is, because, I'm not writing. I don't write guys and dolls. I wish I did. I'd be better off. But what is my job? What is my purpose as someone who's a writer, someone who's constantly grappling with faith all the time, because sort of the press, and it is that aspect of witness, to tell hard truths, not to just tell hard truths. That's not the end, that's the means. Because on the other side of hard truths, if we can get there, is that idea of God as love, of shared community, of one of the first memories I have of coming to All Saints, right, was we came and we were sitting there and there was communion. And if you've ever been at a Catholic church and you're just visiting, you're not in this club, you don't go up for communion. And I remember we're sitting right where Reed is. And Tinker was sitting where Alan is. And she leaned over to us and she said, all are welcome at our table. All are welcome at our table. And that's the job. That's Baldwin's job. He delivers that, he sells that, he lands that, and my job is, as best I can, and with not as sophisticated tools. Kind of annoying. Didn't go to college. It's complete autodidact. Like, okay. Is to follow that footsteps and get to the point through the hard truths, through our pain. And that's what Baldwin said. Why do people hate? People hate because without hate, they will realize their own pain. And to get to the pain, and the other side of that is all are welcome at our table. So I want to conclude with E.L. Doctorow, of all people, who I think sort of sums all of this up. The writer isn't made in a vacuum. Writers are witnesses. The reason we need writers is because we need witnesses to this terrifying century. We need witnesses to this terrifying century. Yes. Yeah. And so I welcome your questions if we have time. Yeah.